we thought it would be more appropriate to have a meeting with the whole board. So I think that you all know Randy, and I'm Alexis. I've attended a few of your meetings and maybe asked a handful of questions, and Jim is here tonight too. So we'd like to just really have an open conversation about the hospital board, about the relationship between the hospital's finances and the subsidy that it receives from the county. Would you like to start? We had a little bit of prepared information, but other than that, we'd really like some dialogue and some question and answers.
I've prepared a piece of paper that I gave to Bill, and you can pass it around and throw it away, whatever you think. We need to establish that everybody's on the same page as to what the responsibilities are of the board to the hospital and to the community and to the Board of County Commissioners. And I've taken the liberty of preparing a paper that I've given to Bill, and he can pass it out. And I'll read some things and we'll talk about some things, and let's see where we're going. The hospital board of directors' primary role is to govern the hospital. That's their job. And to do that, they're responsible for oversight of making the strategic decisions for the hospital, hiring and monitoring an effective CEO, ensuring the hospital is providing quality care, overseeing the hospital's financial well-being, staying educated in healthcare industry news and best practices, and being a representative of the hospital in the community. Those are the jobs of the hospital board, each and every one. Choosing the hospital CEO, he is directly accountable to the board. The board closely monitors and evaluates his work. They advise the CEO on hospital initiatives to be developed, the relationships they want him to cultivate, or her. The compensation of the CEO is also the responsibility of the board to set the salary, establish the budgetary policies, enforce financial controls, and monitoring all that. Making decisions to ensure the financial health and performance of the hospital is the core responsibility of the board. The CEO reports to the board of directors and serves to support and conduct administration for the board. This requires informing board members of the current status of the organization, as well as preferred strategies and resolutions ongoing. The CEO oversees and manages the programs and projects. They recommend the budget to the board. The board does not get involved in the day-to-day operation of the hospital. They hire a management team headed by the CEO to do that. Board members have to be in close communication with the CEO when hiring and reappointing providers. The CEO's responsibility to determine that the hires are properly licensed, there's evidence of property and completed training from an accredited school, there's no history of disciplinary action, and so forth. The board of directors reviews this information and they pass the judgment on the providers. I'm going to skip a lot of this. Bill can pass this out if he wants. One of the main goals of the board is to set up a stable, long-term direction for the hospital. This is called long-term planning. This word and phrase has not been seen in this county in many a long time. It's time we did some long-term planning. The board of directors can have a lasting and positive impact not only on the hospital but on the community as well. The board needs to understand how management approaches conflicts or disagreements with respect to the resolution. They are responsible for ensuring that the hospital resolves all problems. The board should set up and enforce expectations for receiving particular types of compliance-related information from various members of management. It can be helpful and productive for the board to establish clear expectations for members of the management team and hold them accountable for performing and informing the board in accordance with those expectations. As a part of its oversight responsibilities, the board may want to consider conducting regular, and I emphasize regular, executive sessions, that is, sessions excluding senior management. These sessions are with leadership from the compliance, legal, internal audit, quality functions to encourage more open communication. You need to schedule regular executive sessions so that when you call an executive session, it isn't looked at as an untoward offline session. It's a routine thing and it routinely goes on. I'm going to let Bill pass the rest of it out, but we want you to understand that the board of directors needs to get hand and foot in what's going on in that hospital. The board of directors needs to be able to talk budget, personnel matters, responsibility, and oversight. It is your responsibility. It's not the CEO's, it's the board's. Your minutes should reflect all of the things that happen in that hospital that you decide. Any questions on what we as the Board of County Commissioners who appoint the hospital board expect? It's fairly straightforward.
Is this your original work, or did you find this somewhere?
You can find this all over the place. These are standard works, and if you go into Lutz, L-U-T-Z, or any National Hospital Board or any Kansas State Hospital Board, they all have policies and procedures that are covered, and they're all extremely consistent. This is from about 5 or 6 different documents that I've put together. This is not a single hospital's thought. This is a universal hospital board's guidance.
So I believe a lot of this stems from the response that the commission needs to give to the take from the board in some of the meetings that you've expressed that you believe that you're a policy board. Would anyone like to explain what that means? Could we have a little bit of a definition of what that means? I was physically present at 2 meetings when the hospital board self-established the term policy board. So I would like one of the board members to explain what that means, what a policy board is, and why the hospital board is calling itself that as opposed to the commission-appointed hospital board.
Well, I guess I'm obviously the one that made that statement.
One of the times, yes.
It says right here, the board is not involved in the day-to-day operations of the hospital. Okay?
Micromanagement, that's what you read there, yes.
I guess that kind of sums up my thought about how that is. We don't tell Steve who to hire. We don't tell Steve.
You do have to approve his checking of credentials. You do have to approve his hiring. But you don't tell him who to hire, but you have to approve what he does, and you do have a negative vote.
Well, let's do some more defining.
And we do.
Day-to-day operations. Do you want to define that a little bit?
I don't know that we get, or should get, too involved in any of the quote day-to-day operation.
Mm-hmm.
You know, we don't.
So like what the protocols are for the nurses and who's working what shift and what the ins and outs are in the hallways of the hospital.
Exactly.
Right, I think we can all agree on that. Okay. So I don't think we assume that you need to be doing that part of it.
I guess it would be more helpful to know what you assume we aren't doing.
I'd just like to know the definition of the policy board. Policies for what? If it's not micromanaging on the day-to-day aspects of the hospital, then what are the policies that you're overseeing? What are some of the ones that you've created, and how are they playing a role in the management of the hospital currently?
Do your minutes reflect the consideration of salaries for new hires? The board specifically is told to set those salaries.
I feel like we need to start from scratch. If you're a hospital board member, can you raise your hand? So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 in a row, 6, 7. We have 7 out of 7 total. And who has been on the board more than 5 years? 4 of the 7. Who's been on more than 10 years? No one? 1? 1. Okay, so you're the senior member here. Maybe you could explain a little bit. You don't know.
The only comment I'm gonna reply is to Jim. Have you ever seen our bylaws?
No, I have not seen your bylaws. I would like to see your bylaws.
Well, you'd be interested to learn that we have stated in our bylaws, I've counted up to date 15 different responsibilities, amongst other things that we're responsible for. So it's a lot more than what's on your list there. I'll guarantee it.
And
So
that
back-
is a policy.
Huh, I'm sorry.
That is a policy
What is the policy?
Our
in
bylaws.
his hands, it's not the bylaw.
The bylaws are your
Outline the
policies.
policy.
Do you have a policies and procedures in addition to your bylaws?
Yeah, there are several, there are a number of policies and procedures that pertain to departments of the hospital, and we approved one in the last meeting, or meeting before, I forget which one it was. So those exist and they're written, and we approved those.
So the board here hasn't really had this discussion, but I'll express some of my own viewpoint. If you are a policy board, if that's what you want to label yourselves, it would be fiscal policy. So a fiscal policy that you may or may not have, and you can tell me if you have it, would be to pre-approve all appointed hires by your hired director, administrator, CEO, whatever you'd like to label it. Is that a policy of yours? I get one response with a head shake no, out of 7.
We don't approve rank and file employees. We
So
do-
the hospital,
We do approve the credentialing of the providers.
you approved the credentialing,
But not the financial.
not the financial part. So you've never had a discussion as a board about what kind of salaries, what the benefits are, what any of the package is going to be offered for employment for the provider or providers or any of the hires in that aspect? No? I'm getting head shakes, no. Am I
No.
getting anyone that says yes? No.
Not as a whole group in a single discussion.
Okay. So here's the disconnect, in my opinion, and please feel free to chime in. All of the 7 members currently on the hospital board are appointed by the commission, and you serve at the pleasure of the commission. It seems to me as if not having any policy regarding approval of hiring packages as far as finances go would probably be a negligence in the duty of the board to oversee the fiscal aspects of the hospital as a whole. If you have no control over the money and where it's going and some of the largest expenses that are being dispersed, I'm not sure how that correlates to being a policy board when it comes to being totally responsible for the finances. I guess maybe we need to start there.
Well, let's just take the recent example, hiring for doctors.
Yes.
Steve did inform us of what the industry standards are. He informed us that, in the ballpark of what, it was gonna cost us to do that. And we gave him the authority to negotiate the best deal that he could get with those providers. So I don't know whether that fits in your view of how things should work, but that's
So you,
kind of what happened.
okay, so you're saying you were presented a range of an income that the hospital is going to be offering for the new hire.
Yes.
And is it my understanding that you were approving one replacement physician, or did you pre-approve 2 physicians? I guess from listening to the hospital board meetings, I never heard the hospital board approve hiring 2 people when they were doing searching for a new provider. Did that happen in a closed session or something?
I think that it was presented to us as an opportunity that we did not anticipate, and we approved Steve to do that.
I don't feel that way. I mean, I feel like we did get a chance to meet them both, which was great, and we spent quite a, hour with them. But I didn't realize, number one, how much the packages would be. Number two, how much the packages would entail as far as bonuses and moving expenses and all those sorts of things. I did not realize we were going to hire 2 doctors full-time, because I feel like that would have been a red flag for me, because I wouldn't have felt that a pediatrician could be hired full-time in Lincoln County just because of the number of children we do or don't have. So, you know, maybe I was asleep at the wheel, but I do not remember these detailed discussions about any of these things. And I asked what was in the packages because it was never told to us.
So did the board get to meet the new physicians before or after they were hired?
Before.
Before they were hired, and did you get to see their contracts that they were being asked to sign?
To my knowledge, I
No.
still haven't seen a contract.
Can anyone affirm, because I'm getting some head shakes, no. Does anyone want to say that they did? Did anyone individually get to see them and it wasn't really done at a board meeting or something? I mean, I'm just questioning here. No, okay. So that I would say is probably where I, as part of the commission, have an issue. If the hospital board is going to expect the county to subsidize the operation, don't you think it might be appropriate for the board to see the contracts and know the exact numbers before the hire and approval is done?
Who are you referring to as the board? The hospital board trustees?
Hospital
Or the board
board.
Yes, sir, the
Hospital board.
hospital board. That's, yeah. All 7 of you. And if it's a financial, I mean, if it's a contract and negotiation, it can be done in closed session. Once it becomes a financial piece of information, it's open record.
What do you think a locum tenens costs?
A what?
A locum tenens, you don't know that term?
I don't run the hospital, no,
Well,
you're,
to the medical code, that is a doctor that comes in agency. So what would you guess an agency doctor gets paid per hour? Per hour.
I don't know what they get paid
Probably
per hour
more than-
agency.
It would blow the budget way up.
But I think you're trying to point out something about finances saying that the amount that they were offered was appropriate. I'm not
I don't
questioning.
know, I'm not a doctor,
Yeah.
and neither are you. I mean, that's.
What does
crazy.
that have to do with the board not seeing the contracts and knowing how much their new hires are going to
I
get
just
paid?
feel, I mean, the way this was presented in the beginning, I felt like I'm in like kindergarten. And we got non-medical folk telling medical folk how things should go. The board's doing all that, what he mentioned.
I don't think that you can make that statement because
Well,
I don't
I
think
didn't
you
have
know.
the list, but a lot of the things that I heard come out of his mouth,
But wait a minute.
I've heard at meetings.
Okay, to go back to what you just said, we were specifically talking about the board making policies and the board being fiscally responsible. So forget the medical jargon. We can all learn a different language. I know French. Do you know a different language? So I don't care about the medical jargon. What I'm getting at is the responsibility of the board. So there's a fiscal responsibility, and my question is, did the board see, and we have a recent example, this is just an overall policy. This has nothing to do with who was hired or exactly what they were paid,
It's
except
about
what,
money, is what it is.
but where do you think that money's coming from?
My hard work, the county's hard work, 85% of critical access hospitals rely on their community. That's the United States of America.
We
85%.
understand that the hospital is being subsidized by taxes. We understand that. It's been going on since the creation of the hospital. In fact, a little bit of history, which most of you probably don't know, the hospital was established under state statute with 4 mills. So the 4 represents any number that equivalates to 1,000th of whatever the total mill rate is, okay? So in the current year, we're at 61, and I'm rounding these numbers off, we're at 61 million valuation for our total county property, for taxable property, okay? So 61 million. So right now, 1 mill is at 61,000. So in years past, in the original establishment of the hospital, it was 4 mil. So whatever that dollar amount was for that year, times 4 was that many mil went to the hospital. There was a public vote where the public said, yes, in any given year, we allow you to impose additional taxes on us up to an additional 6.89, 6 point,
What's 7.39, I believe.
But that's
I
more than,
recall,
and that's more than
the
10.
mill levy that passed
10.89.
in, I believe it was the year 2000, August of 2000, was an increase to 7.86 mills, I believe, for a total of,
So that would be more than the 10.89,
yeah,
huh? That would be over 11.
I think,
It would be,
yeah, I think so.
well,
Again, you're catching me.
we'll have to, yeah, I don't
Off
have that
the
paperwork in
numbers
front of me.
in front of me.
What I'm getting at is the original establishment of the hospital required 4 mil from the county, whatever that number is. And then there was a public vote that the public said, yes, you may increase that up to, and right now, what I saw on paper was 10.86. So it is the commission's decision to give that additional over the 4. In total, in part, not at all, etc. 4 years ago, our county valuation dramatically increased, so much so that the subsidy to the hospital actually increased by nearly $200,000 in 1 year, just because of the valuation. Not because the commission made a decision to give more money, because that dollar amount equal to the portion of the total valuation of the property increased because the valuation went up. So we know that the county is subsidizing the operation. We know that property taxes do go into a lot of rural hospitals. That's not the question. The question is how much. The question is what percentage of the budget, and the question is to what extent is that going to increase. In the near future, we're going to see a drop in valuation. That's a given, because our valuation, are you questioning that, or
I've never seen valuations go down in my lifetime of living on a farm or in a farm campus.
I think it will though, because it's on an 8-year sliding scale now, and about 8 years ago, land was high because we had, land went up because price of, like crops was high, and we had good yields for a few years there, about 8 years ago. So a lot of people, they're making 80 bushel a mile or 120 bushel a mile, and it was $8, $7 a bushel then. So everybody went out and did buy more land, so the valuation went up. But now it has, she's right, it's come down in the last.
That's absolutely not the reason. I won't argue with your logic, but that's absolutely not the reason.
what do you mean that the value?
The sale price of ag land has absolutely nothing to do with it.
It's not the sale price of the ag land, it's the price of the commodities. So when right now we're at a bushel per acre, per wheat.
The reason that
350
ag land,
Lincoln.
it is, there's 3 components to the ag land value. It's the yields, the average yields, the average commodity prices, and the capitalization rate. So all of those things, well, the 2 things, the income and the commodity prices, the rents, are on 8-year rolling averages.
Yes.
So they will always lag behind what the market does.
Yes, and we've already hit the peak of the 8 years. That's what I'm trying to explain.
And so they'll be turned. The cap rate is set by the director of property valuation and hasn't changed for many years. So you're right, the
Well,
ag land.
commodity values have come down.
The ag land will cycle.
Yeah,
And what I'm,
It typically won't go down as much as
it goes up.
as it goes up. I
Okay.
mean, overall the trend, but it's a long trend and it's always out of sync with what's going on in the ag economy.
absolutely.
So.
And it's purposefully done that way. I mean,
But, and we have, 90-some% of our valuation in ag land, right?
yes,
Yeah,
And virtually no commercial,
correct.
some residential, and then you've got the oil and gas value, or the
Yes.
Well,
They call it
utility.
utilities, yeah.
utility valuation,
Mhm.
which the utility valuation has absolutely nothing to do with what's out here, except for an apportionment formula that they use. And it's basically that whoever owns that pipeline, they capitalize the value of their stock and apply value to the entire company and then apportion it among the counties. So that's, I don't think anybody really understands how that works.
But the overall ag market is still going to affect that as well, and we're
It will,
looking at
but-
it.
It will, but if the stock market crashes and the valuation of your transfer or your pump station, you could lose that too, or it could go the other way. I mean, the increase in the value of your utilities could more than offset your ag.
Right.
So, to predict that, but generally speaking, when I worked in this building, the valuation was 28 million. So, now we're at 61 million.
Ooh, that's 57
But you have to also
this year.
take into account inflation, because the value of the dollar is not the same.
Well, no,
But what I'm getting at
valuation's
is,
valuation, right?
4
So-
years ago, you're
so,
looking
know,
at,
It's gonna cycle, but is it gonna go back to 30? No, it's
okay,
not.
but what I'm trying to get across is 4 years ago, you're looking at the hospital taking about a little over $350,000.
Right.
Now, you're talking about a valuation that would be equal to over $600,000.
Right.
So for the hospital to just absorb that tax money, how can the commission continue to do that at that rate and still be internally funding and maintaining our own fiscal responsibility? That's what we're ultimately getting to here. You have a question?
And that, I guess that's the point I would make to Chris's point, which is that, you know, our accountant was here and he just talked about the hospitals having operational and non-operational funding. But our job as a board is to make sure that our operational funding is as precise as possible so that the non-operational won't have to step in and clean up mistakes. And that's why, to me, it's not, I feel like we say, well, you know, the county will cover it, and the county shouldn't have to cover it. Not saying that they should have to not cover anything, but if we're making mistakes or failing in our duties, that's costing by mismanagement or by not looking into these things we should be looking into, then we're more reliant on the county than we should be or than we need to be. And that, to me, is really the question. I brought up a lot of questions in recent months, well, actually in the past year, and I feel like the board often says, well, we're a policy board, but I can't remember in all the years I've been on the board a single policy we've made.
Yeah, let's go back to that question. What are the policies that have been established by the board and how are they carried out?
Well, again, I think I said earlier, we have policies and procedures that apply to the operation of the hospital and the individual departments, and we have.
You're saying those are already written down?
Yes.
In your bylaws.
Well, in addition to the bylaws.
Okay.
There are
And is that something that you edit every year, or?
I don't know if we do it every year, but we do it periodically.
So then what does the board meet for if your policies are already written down and that's all you do is make policies? What do you meet for monthly?
Approve accounts payables.
Yeah.
Approve accounts
We
payable?
pay the bills, we credential providers, we hear the administrative report about what pertinent items are going on in the month and
Okay, I'm hearing you.
what things are coming up and he informs us as to what decisions he's made and.
Okay.
And so I mean,
But again, as you say that you approve accounts payable and you hear the reports from your administrator, et cetera, you're also telling me that you don't look at the contracts before you approve that money that's going to be spent in the contract.
No,
Do you see what I'm saying? Do you see the disconnect there?
we did not approve a dollar amount. In the negotiation of the hiring of the two providers that we did, which that seems to be the elephant in the room, we did not.
Well, it's one of the
specify-
increased expenses between last year and this year, and I think it's being portrayed, as I've heard in the last meeting, that the lack of the county giving the full 10 mills is what's going to hurt the budget for the hospital, and that's exactly not true, because the increased expenses is what creates the deficit in the budget. So that goes back to, did you pre-approve 2 doctors, did you pre-approve the amount, and then if you did or didn't, what is the reasoning for that, and then why wasn't it informed to the commission that you were going to need additional money to cover that deficit? That's kind of where we're going with that.
Was that 10.86 mills that you're talking about
Yes.
voted on by the people?
So the original 4, and this is the way that I understand it.
No, the 10.86, the last one in '03, that charter resolution that was voted on by the people, correct or not correct?
No, not correct. It's not 10.86. It's a number in addition to the 4, which we just had a conversation. We're not sure if it's
6.86
Okay.
plus, but an option of 3 mills.
But the way that any public vote works is the public is saying to the commission, you may, in any given year, tax us an additional X amount of mills. It's not a mandated, you will tax X and it will go to Y, which I think is some of the miscommunication about all of the publicly funded, publicly voted and mill levy funded operations in the county.
Well, I guess I would like to say that, perhaps we were wrong in not anticipating that. In my memory, we've never been questioned about that. We had our mill levy, we got the money. With respect to the hiring of the providers, and Lorelai's memory of it or not, we did have a discussion about, let's back up a little bit. You know, we had a situation with the prior provider that was ongoing and handled as best we could. But during that ongoing situation, we did give Steve the direct order to actively recruit additional providers. Okay, so that was a board action. We said, you know, we need to get somebody in here because we're going to get caught that up. Okay, that's the bottom line. So, you know, that's a part of this charge, and we don't know what it takes to hire a doctor. We don't know, so we delegated that authority to him. I will say that the approval of 2 as opposed to 1 came with a discussion about the fact that, you know, this was an unexpected opportunity where, in fact, we lost a doctor, gained another one. But in the past, we've had more than 1 doctor here. And it was Steve's indication to the board that given a little bit of time and some marketing, I don't, you know, you notice Steve is carrying on a quite aggressive marketing campaign, that we could actually build our healthcare system here to support 2 doctors. Is that going to happen overnight? No, it's not. But I think as a board, we had faith that Steve was going to be able to accomplish that goal, and we did not anticipate that all of a sudden we weren't going to get our X number of mills. So, you know, we had no past history of that not happening, and so, you
May
know,
I ask a question?
So there we go.
So then, in that budget, and you're talking about a vision of expansion, and that was part of the plan, and it was an unexpected opportunity to have 2 hires instead of 1. In that budget, then, were you expecting 10 mills equal to at least the valuation that was created the year before? Is that what I'm assuming? Okay. And I will claim a lot of responsibility in this, because these 2 weren't even on the board, and I have been. And for 2.5 years, I was not up to date on what we should be doing with the hospital or with the hospital board. It was presented to me in such a way that one of the seated elected officials had already been dealing with this, and it was kind of a delegated responsibility for that representative to be involved with you all. And I was never updated. At a commission meeting, I can tell you in 2 years, I was never given an actual report. I attended the hospital board meeting, and this is what they're doing. And so if you all had a vision of growth and were planning an increased expense for the county to help subsidize for any amount of time with some sort of end date or expectation, that was never conveyed. And so here we are. I've been here 2.5 years, and we're having our first board meeting between the 2 boards, and I failed to understand the seriousness of how there needs to be that kind of communication. Because ultimately, and I can tell you this whether you like it or not, you're appointed by the board and you can be removed by the board, this board. This board appoints every seat and can remove from those seats. So really, it behooves both boards to have really good communication and kind of know what that plan is. So there's a big miscommunication there as we shrunk some of our expenditures and you were planning on this growth.
I would like to speak to 2 of the points Rodney just made. One, and these are not the faults of Steve. To me, these are the faults of the board, myself included. One was, I actually suggested we should recruit, because I said we've been trying for years to get a doctor out of Hayes or Salina, and nothing's happened. Let's throw the net out wider. And Steve said, okay, but it's going to cost you. And we said, okay, with no idea what it was going to cost us. That was never discussed. I didn't find out that number until, I still don't know. Somebody told me recently what they think it was. Another example, he said, we don't know what it takes to hire a doctor. I agree with that, but we should have asked Steve what it takes to hire a doctor. we should have been asking all the questions about what was expected, you know, it's kind of like we just said, okay, we trust you, go do it. And it's not that I don't trust Steve, it's just that to me it feels like an abdication of responsibility because we should have been more involved in those decisions. And then I can give one other example. We had a problem with our 340B money. And to my knowledge, unless I missed it, it was never explained to us. We were just paying back money, paying back money, paying back money with no idea why. And finally, one of the board members said, what's the deal with all this 340B money going back? And then Steve was like, oh yeah, well, and he and Tanya tried to explain it. But to me, that's something the board, we should have known. We're going to lose
Well,
however many
let's stop there.
thousands.
Is there someone else on the board that can explain that? Because I'm still a little foggy on that issue. Is there another board member besides you, because you're still saying that you're not really sure? Is there a board member, like a long-sitting board member, that can explain what that process was, or do you know where you are financially on that particular scenario?
I will answer, the answer to your question is yes, we know where we are financially on that. We did have to refund some money. I think, I don't know about Lorelai's perception of that, I think we knew pretty quickly after it started to happen. And, you know, the medical world was so incredibly complicated. We embarked in that 340B program.
What is 340B?
It's a program that was set up by the federal government, and it allows us to get money back. So we buy drugs from pharmaceutical companies, and through this program, based on how much we buy, we can get a portion of that back.
So you can,
Now, I
it's
don't know
basically
the
like
mechanism that
is it like a
happens.
purchasing?
I don't know the mechanism for how that happens. Jack Crispin, as the pharmacist, took on administration of that program, and I understand that we had a consulting company that was helping us do that. And through a misinterpretation of the regulations, and I don't know on whose part, but we were given too much money, so we had to refund it.
I understood all that. My issue with it was that I feel like we discovered that rather than we were explained that. Do you understand what I'm saying?
It wasn't presented with with formal figures and a formal explanation.
Right, it was just like, hey, where does all this money go? Oh, well, I guess we should try to explain that. And to me, those are the things that we should know before anyone does. Those should be, before we start paying them back, we should know.
I think there's a door there.
That would just be another example where I feel like we were kind of in the dark, and, you know, it's our fault as much as anyone's, but we need to be on top of those financial things so we're not finding out about them later, in my opinion.
Is that what, I'm still confused on that 340B also, is that, and you've explained, Steve, pretty much to me before, but I still don't conceive of what's going on with it. So we thought we was gonna get a discount on some drugs, but we didn't get as much discount as we thought, so now we owe more money back, is that how
No, they
it works?
overpaid us because the firm we had allegedly to help us manage the pharmacy part, the actual retail pharmacy part, were writing prescriptions. The physicians weren't eligible and the patients weren't eligible, so that's what we had to refund. We knew that as soon as the audit was over. We have a formal audit by person on our 340B program, which was reflected on a regular basis in the minutes for the Board of Trustees of Lincoln County Hospital. So when we knew what our plan of correction looked like, that was discussed with the board. And I can go back and.
Oh, no, I know you discussed it.
We can pull all of those records that's reflected in the minutes, where now we think we're done with the refunds.
Okay.
So-
No, I know,
But
I,
it's-
Was that over 1 year of participating in the program, or was
Oh,
it
no,
multiple years?
I think I would have to go back and look at it, but I think it was just an 18-month audit, the most recent 18 months. 2018.
The audit was done in 2018, so from that point backward 18 months.
Yep.
But how long had the hospital been participating in 340B altogether?
I think since it began, which is, as I recall, in the early 2000s.
So then, was the management firm doing the purchasing for the hospital?
No, they were supposed to be managing the prescription end of it and managing who wrote what prescriptions and things of that nature. And they did not do the job they should have done. But as I've said to the Board of County Commissioners before, basically we got the money, so we had to refund it to pharmaceutical companies.
And the
And
total,
so
and the total of that was again,
I don't have those figures off the top of my head. It was a pretty good chunk.
And we're still doing it
Mr.
now.
Bernberg, I think you said you kind of knew where you were financially with that. What was the total on that payback amount?
No, I didn't say I knew what we were financially, I just said that I believe that we knew about the problem with,
Am I guessing with like the 150,000 range?
That's a little low.
It's a little
I thought it
low.
was more like 300,000, but I might be wrong.
Oh, it was
We had a
300,000?
number, yeah.
So you've had an
It's in
additional
the-
$300,000 worth of expenses that you had already had as income and that, okay. So I'd like to clarify here that the potential $110,000 that didn't come with the increase in valuation this year compared to last year with the hospital being now budgeted by the commission 500,000 instead of 610,000 approximately. I'd like to clarify that you've had additional expenses, one of which we've just named, which is 340B, which is $300,000.
Approximately.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. I'd like to get some of these numbers in the air because I think some of the propaganda out there is that the hospital is now going to experience a budget shortfall because they're not getting 10.86 mils, when in all actuality, you've already had to spend $300,000 extra from this particular issue. So, just clarification.
As we had this discussion earlier, Madam Commissioner, I explained all of that to you at our meeting in June. when we
Right, but this is
discussed
going to be a
all of it.
specific
We-
meeting that
we-
anyone
we-
can
we have
access so that they know what
discussed
the real numbers
on more
are.
than one occasion.
Right, and
With
clarification
you
is good.
And with, well, not these exact members of the board, but with your board in public session,
That's great.
all right?
I appreciate
And,
that,
and
more than you know.
we came and explained it to you.
That's
There were
wonderful.
some other extraordinary expenses as
so-
well. And I would go back and you talk about lack of communication. We were trying to explain this to you, but the board, unbeknownst to us, changed the way they do their budgeting on an annual basis.
No, we
Without
didn't
without
change.
informing the hospital or the hospital board that you were making changes in the way the budget was done.
Sir, that's not correct.
We've had this
That's
argument
absolutely
before. Let's go on to something
No,
else.
but that's not correct, because we never changed the
I know,
way we do the budget.
We had this very same argument, both sides. My question to the board is, you're responsible for the fiscal management. That's your main job. When you had this one-time good deal of getting a second doctor, I mean, it's a great deal. Did the board make a conscious decision to hire that second doctor? Yes or no?
yes.
Did the board decide how you were going to fund that second doctor? Is that in your minutes?
No.
How did you plan on paying the money over and above the budget that you already had? What were you going to do for funds? You didn't come to us and say anything about it. Did you have a secret cash? Were you going to cut something? How did you intend to pay for that second doctor? I don't care how good a deal it is, you got to pay for it.
Well,
James, the doctors are cash machines. They earn.
They might be earning, but they don't give you $300,000 this year out of this budget. That earning is going to take place 5 or 10 years from now, but not now. You got to pay for it now. Their salary doesn't come out in 10 years. It comes out of this budget. And I don't think the board considered that. And I think when you didn't do that, you failed in your financial job. Unless you have minutes in there that said, yeah, we got a one-time good deal and we're going to take this 300,000 or whatever number it is to fire that doctor, and we're going to take it out of this fund or that fund, or we're going to go to the county commission and say, we got a one-time good deal, we need some more money. None of that happened, as far as I know.
Jim, in both our budget and yours at the county, there's budget and there's cash, okay? So your cash doesn't ever equal your budget, right?
That's exactly right.
So I think that we felt that we had enough cushion in our cash to fund that until the doctors got up to speed.
But do the minutes of the board reflect that? Did you make a conscious fiscal decision, recorded in the minutes of the board that you discussed it?
No, we
Then,
did
see,
not
that's,
say.
that's my complaint, is we can't do a trail, we can't figure out what you've done and what you haven't done because you don't make any recorded deliberations, and that's your job.
Well, I have a question about that, because, and back to your comment, you said the doctors kind of create the cash flow. I'm a little confused, and forgive my ignorance about your particular budget, but it looks to me like the majority of the loss of everything in the overall budget is happening in the clinics. And the doctors are employed in the clinics, and I'm not sure what percentage of their work they're doing actually in the hospital. So the hospital is kind of riding the thin red line, let's call it that, for lack of a fancy term, and the clinics are carrying all the loss. So if the doctors are employed in the clinics and that's the heaviest loss, then how do we go back to the conversation about them creating the cash?
I'm not an accountant, so I can't answer.
Well, someone else on the board?
Lexi, you gotta realize, a new doctor is not gonna generate as much revenue if he gets his practice built up as what the previous doctor was. You realize that. He gets a doctor, like, that works in the hospital, gets paid for admitting, correct me if I'm wrong, Steve, admitting swing bed, and overseeing the bed level. He gets paid extra above his clinical work in the clinic. Until he gets, I'm saying it's going to take 2 years at least to him to get his practice established to get back up where the previous doctor was.
Okay, but historically, there's always a loss in the clinics. So what you're saying is you're increasing the expense to the clinics by having the 2 doctors instead of 1, regardless of their ability to generate revenue. From the budget that I saw, you guys were going to expect Sylvan to increase revenue by 50% and Lincoln by 30%, which still creates a deficit, however, potentially helps cover the deficit created by the duplicate hire.
And I've been on the board on, 12 years, so I've never seen a clinic in the back. And so they're always, because the value for what's paid for a doctor's, plus what is generated in the clinic, and has been in the red for 12 years.
Correct. So that just goes
Correct.
back to what I'm saying.
Yeah.
To expand the operations of the clinic, which are already carrying the majority of the deficit, I'm wondering, and you're knowing that you're never going to cover that, so then you hire 2 to partake in that process. And what portion of their time, to the board, this is my question, what portion of their time is going into the hospital to pay them whatever it is out of their contract that the hospital can cover that then the clinics don't have to cover?
Well, you know, we don't expect the hospital or the clinics to make money. That's why we subsidize. We do expect that the loss that you incur, and you can predict that because you've been doing it for 10 or 15 years, you know it's going to be lost, you know about how much. And we know that you can budget to cover that loss, taking funds from other places. Our concern is when you create a tremendous amount of debt that you don't have covered in your budget, and you don't have any rhyme or reason for it in written record, then we get concerned because you don't come to us and say, here's a one-time good deal we got, or here's a problem we're having, or the building fell down, we got to have a new one. For whatever reason, you need more money, you got to come to us and tell it. But it's all got to be backed up with official board deliberation and documentation. And we don't feel that you're getting the right deliberation and documentation put down on the paper.
One of the problems that I see with this situation is that one of the 2 doctors we hired is a pediatrician who can only see children 0 through 18. And I like Yasmin. I've had, 7 appointments with her in the time that she started working, and I really appreciate having a pediatrician across the street from my house. But I don't think it justifies having her full-time because we can't produce work for her full-time. And that, to me, I guess, is just one of the discussions we should have had in advance. Like, if we're hiring a pediatrician, can our county support a pediatrician? How much is she going to be working? How much are we going to pay her for the amount that she's working? That discussion was not had in advance. And to me, that was a real worry for me because I didn't see how we were going to pay for her. And I don't still see.
We had that discussion a little while.
Well, you must have had it at 6 because I didn't hear it right before I got there.
All in the minutes, right?
Yeah, is that in the minutes? Because I don't remember it.
Well, just fill us in on the discussion, because I wasn't there. No.
We felt that we could draw patients from Russell County and Ellsworth County and maybe Mitchell County. Because they don't have pediatricians. We thought if we get one here, we could draw people from outside the county in.
And did you do some financials just to figure out what kind of numbers you'd have to generate to cover that as far as actual physical visits and numbers as far as increased patient clientele?
No, I don't believe so.
Do you see an influx of patients from other counties?
Yes, we see
We don't have the information.
patients from Mitchell County, we get patients from Russell and Ellsworth County.
A large amount
Numbers
or
are going up.
just
We
some?
also get numbers Ottawa County and Saline County, so we are starting to see those numbers tick up, which is what we were looking at. So, yes, we have a fairly large catchment area where we are. And in fact, I was visiting with Dr. Chima the other day, and he's seeing a continuing increase in the number of patients we're getting from Mitchell County.
But you have to balance that with the patients that are leaving Lincoln going to other places
Well,
too.
we're not seeing a lot of medical records flowing out. I know there's been a lot of loose talk that something like 800 patients left. We have not sent out even 50 people transfer out of our clinics in the past 9 months. We haven't seen that kind of out migration. So you talk about a lot of loose talk. Yeah, there's
I haven't
loose
even
talk.
actually
So,
heard that, but we have a
Yeah.
question.
I would just like to say that the trend is countywide. In our department, we're seeing more Russell County, more Mitchell County, more Saline County, Ottawa County patients, because as the doctors get full, ComCare owns all the doctors in every county around us except Mitchell, and as they get full, or they demand things of their patients that are unreasonable, we are starting to see them move back towards us. So I'm just going to echo that it's a trend countywide, not just our clinic because of the new doctors. They are.
Which is good news for us.
It is good news.
Yeah.
for us.
So it is.
Riding my horse then, are these numbers being provided to the board so they can adjust their budget for next year? Or are you gonna wait till the next year and do it?
Remember, Tim, this is a new precedent here.
I understand that.
This is the first year of this new precedent. In the past, we've always, hello,
But you still ought to be starting to see this stuff being presented to the board so you can work your budget with more knowledge.
Would you like us to present a 6-month budget, since we kind of know what the trend is now?
That's an excellent idea.
It would be interesting to see a temporary provision if that is within your capability.
Our budget process is key for our fiscal year, which is April 1 to March 31. So we're getting ready to start developing the budget for our next fiscal year in the next probably 45 days we'll start.
You see, the earlier we get information, the better we can put together our budget
Right.
and thus your budget. If we wait till the last minute or if we wait till after your budget is finalized,
Well, that's
we're out
what
of luck.
changed this year. That's what changed this year.
I understand.
It happened differently in years prior, so we were kind of caught off guard.
But
And,
as I keep telling these people, that's in the rearview mirror. Let's don't look back there.
Right.
Let's figure out where we're going from
Yeah.
here.
But yes, we're developing. In fact, we've already had preliminary discussions about our budget with the CFO, so that'll be coming up here pretty shortly for making sure the numbers we plug in there. And,
The earlier we can see a major aberration in the funds, either up or down, the better it's gonna be for everybody.
Well, understand. We were talking about budget process, and we do have a budget process that I didn't know what it was like before I got here. We do have a budget process here now.
We
One of the
appreciate
things we
information.
also did early on in my tenure here at the board's instigation was we did have a day-long strategic planning session, and almost everything that we talked about and the things we developed were based on the premises that went into that strategic plan at that point in time. Part of which was developing a budget on a regular basis. The other parts were developing a succession plan for the positions and other providers that we have here, and making that work. So it's not like we haven't been doing the planning. And as we noted, as Alexis noted earlier, I don't think, there may have been one or two meetings in the 5.5 years I've been here that we did not have the county commissioner present for all of our discussions about all of these matters except the executive sessions that involve personnel matters and things of that nature.
So then was that representative from our board engaging you, asking questions or figuring anything out, or was it just like an idle bystander? Because I was never given any reciprocal information, is what I'm saying.
I guess we can't speak for that member, but he certainly had the opportunity to.
I'm not denying the opportunity. I'm just saying, we talk about the communication breakdown. We're trying to engage you as a full
Right.
board. And I think I can speak for this board when I say our goal is to decrease the dependency of the hospital financial situation on the county. That's our ultimate goal. I mean, it speaks volumes to the efficiency and the performance of our hospital when they actually need less county subsidy. So I think we can agree, all of us, the board appointees that we appoint, that should be our ultimate goal. So to be disappointed in a reduction of funds, I can understand that it felt like in a hindsight, because you've already prepared your budget. You've already expected that 600,000, and now it's been cut to 500,000. So I understand how that feels as almost a squeeze, especially when you have a $300,000 unexpected expense with the 340B, you have an additional doctor to fund that you didn't have the year before, et cetera, and the cost of everything goes up, we know that. And I know that there's a struggle budgeting for the difference between what your allowed reimbursements are versus what your actual cost is going to be to run the hospital. I understand all that in a general sense, but we should all be on the same page knowing that the more efficient you are, and if we are gaining back people that have been going out of county, or even getting people that are out of county to come here as an overflow, then really that speaks volumes to how our hospital can operate and fund itself, needing less assistance.
Well, I hate to disabuse you of that notion.
Why is that?
I think the general trend for critical access hospitals in small rural communities is they're going to need more subsidies from their counties. Even prosperous counties like Dover County subsidizes their hospital for well over $1 million a year. So we're kind of on the low end.
Well, they also do that for their nursing home.
Yeah,
And
that's
I
all-
will tell you
that's all
that different
budgeted.
governmental bodies choose to do that. So when you have social programs like that, where you're using tax dollars to subsidize those kind of functions, that is ultimately the decision of whatever government is in place at the
That's
time.
true.
And so it swings with the political pendulum. And what I'm saying is, financially, if you're talking simultaneously expanding with needing more subsidy, I do not believe that Lincoln County is going to afford that. So if the expansion is at the cost of the county, then maybe that needs to be reanalyzed. And one discussion maybe we need to have is, what is the foundation doing for the hospital for the plan for the expansion? Because that kind of seems to be a foggy subject as well, that I'm not clear on at all.
Well, our foundation, Lincoln County Hospital and Healthcare Foundation, does provide us funding, as I discussed with you at one of our prior
Mhm.
And so you asked me what the capital expenditure
Any
is,
non-operating
and I told
expense
you
and-
it's
mhm.
non-operating
Gotcha.
expense, it's investments in things.
Mhm.
Like the foundation has bought us a number of things for the ER. We're currently funding some new lab equipment purchases because things get old, wear out, and we've got to replace it. The next thing they'll be doing is basically, because of one of the requests they got from a Lincoln County, former Lincoln County resident, we spend XYZ dollars on laboratory equipment, which is what we're doing. Our stuff's wearing out, we've got to replace it.
And
So our foundation basically, without any staff at all, does help us quite a bit with funding those capital kinds of expenditures.
Mhm.
But some things are going to be probably beyond their reach.
I was referring to the expansion planning. So
Right.
is there an expansion planning? What is it? How is this going to play out? And is that going to equal more subsidy from the county? Is that why you're saying that the trend is going to be an increased subsidy?
Well, for a variety of reasons. The federal government is not going to, and the state government basically are not going to pay us anymore for our Medicare and Medicaid patients. If you look at our basic demographics, most of the Lincoln County hospitals operations are paid for by the federal government through the Medicare program. And that is, they do not reimburse us what our actual cost of providing that care is. When we look at our payer mix, our primary payer is Medicare. And even in the clinic, that's 41%. Okay? And then that's followed by Medicaid, which is about 12%. And then Blue Cross and Blue Shield, which I believe is about 10%. So I'm going off, I haven't looked at these numbers for a while. But all of those payers cap their payments to us. They dictate to us what we get paid. It doesn't matter what we charge. We can charge $1 million a visit. Blue Cross and Blue Shield is only going to pay us $10. So we don't have very many options of, say, increasing our charges to generate income. We are trying to find some new avenues for revenues, and we are working on a couple of different aspects of that. But as far as making the subsidy go away, if you
No, that's not, you're off base from the question. The question was in regards to the expansion plan. What is the expansion plan?
well, we haven't formalized it yet, but we have been looking at the idea of building a new clinic so that we have an appropriate facility for doctors to operate out of. But that's not been a formal kind of inquiry yet at all, because we're
But
trying to
hasn't
figure
the
out how to-
foundation already purchased property for that part of the plan? You said it's not a formal plan, but they've already acted on it?
Well, I'll let Mr. Serene talk about that, but it's always been one of the goals, I was told, for the hospital board and the foundation, that if property comes up where our footprint is, that's something you want to acquire, because otherwise we are pretty much landlocked, and that doesn't give any room for expansion. So that my quick answer on that was that Mr. Serene basically founded the foundation and has been an important member of the board and that organization. So I'll let him answer.
Coffee came up for sale, it was offered privately, so we had the money and we bought it. Whether we use it for a clinic or leave the house there for local tenants or something like that, that's gonna be a matter of something in the future.
The foundation owns that, right? Not the hospital.
Right.
Foundation owns it, yes.
I'd like to address, and I don't know if you guys understand the relationship between what the foundation does for us and what these capital purchases do for us. Our reimbursement from our major payers depends on our cost report. In other words, they want to know what our costs reimburse us a percentage of that. Part of our costs is depreciation, okay? And so we need to constantly find outside revenue sources to buy equipment that we can then own and depreciate.
Right.
So we have no out-of-pocket
Expense.
cost for that x-ray machine or
But
whatever.
you can still depreciate the cost of your
But
cost
once
report.
we own it, we can depreciate it. And I'm in fear that, you know, our machines, our lab analyzers and our x-ray machines, those are relatively small items in the big scheme of things. So Steve is right, we don't really have a formalized expansion, and I'm not quite sure what you mean by expansion or in what terms, but at some point, we need to build a clinic because our hospital physical plant is going to be fully depreciated and our reimbursements are going to be cut significantly. So if we don't keep adding to our physical plant in order to generate that depreciation, we're going to be a whole lot worse off than we are today. So that's something that we've constantly had in mind. It's kind of back there in the background that, you know, we haven't come out and said, hey, we're raising money to build a clinic or anything like that. But, you know, when a piece of land comes up and the foundation can help fund that small step in the process, then, you know, that's another thing that we, or I believe, will advise to take advantage of.
But if you did build a new clinic, you would probably need funds extra. That'd be pretty expensive. So would you need county funds then from us?
You know, I don't know that. I mean, it's way too early to say. Maybe somebody.
Well, that's because, you know, building a new clinic would probably be pretty expensive. And I know you would want that, then you would have more assets to depreciate, and that'd be your cost, so you can get more Medicare or whatever because of your expense. I realize what you're doing, but you're forced then to always buy more capital, but you gotta pay for that capital somehow. That's the biggest problem too here.
You know,
But, and, you know,
like I say, someday we're gonna have to address that, either directly head on, or else somebody's gonna die and leave us $1 million. And if that's the case, then we'll probably come and say, hey, we have this opportunity, let's do this relatively low cost now than later. But, I mean, I don't know, I'm just thinking out loud.
yeah,
but-
no, I know what you're, and I'm not against what you're wanting to do, it's just, everything, you know, we're at a small county of 3,100 people, and we have a limited budget, unless we raise taxes. That's what it all comes back to. How much money do you want the commissioners to spend, or how much does the county want to spend? It's nice to have a lot of that stuff, but it costs money, and we have a lot of people in this county with elderly. You know, we talked about cutting some people, like we had to cut you, we cut you guys, we cut the nursing home, we cut the Lincoln Council on the Aging. And a lot of people say that hit, well, they say that hurt a lot of the elderly, and maybe it did. But I've had ladies come to me, widow ladies, who own a house, and they said, please don't raise my property tax, because they get making $500 or $600 a month in Social Security. So that end of it coming too. They can't afford it either. So we got both sides we got to look at and all that stuff.
Why don't you write a long-range plan and look out 5 or 10 years and decide when you would best like to have that clinic? And as you do that, you can start figuring out what you have to operate that clinic. You have to have more personnel and that stuff. You could give us 2 or 3 or 4 years notice, and we could start planning that in the budget, rather than come in this afternoon and say, we're gonna have a new clinic tomorrow, and we've gotta have another $6 million or some ridiculous number. Give us a long-range plan. You can do that. You can say in 5 years, we're gonna have a bigger clinic, we're gonna need another doctor, 3 more nurses, whatever you're gonna have, and we can start scheduling that into our budget process.
If I may
We
add
have
to
to raise
that,
the taxes, right?
If we have to raise them, we will at least be looking forward in time to raise them, and we can go to the electorate and have an election. We can't have an election anymore this year after we got your thing, because it's too short. You gotta have lead time, that's
well,
all we
also,
want.
we're still paying on the hospital bond until 2035. So
But
we,
we're paying on the hospital.
Yeah.
well,
But if
it's
you
a
guys,
wash of
but if you
our
guys
money
run
either
into a
way,
financial
but-
situation, it comes back to us commissioners.
Exactly.
But
Ultimately,
you guys
we hold the
realize
responsibility for that.
That $400,000 that we're paying to the PBC, that we're generating $2.88 million in annual payroll for people like these. keep it back here.
I'm not against the hospital, I like the hospital, and it isn't good to have it as a, for all of us, for services and for employment. You got a good point now, and I'm not against that. It's just that everything costs again, and we gotta pay for it with one way or the other, taxes or something. That's where,
Would you allow to go to vote
We
next
did-
spring?
what?
Would you allow the citizens to vote?
We
on
don't
it?
have a choice on that. It can be brought to a vote just by the public doing it. You don't have to have our permission to have a public vote. But I will tell you again, when you
So-
do that, as if the publicly instituted mill is mandatory, that's not true. A publicly instituted mill is still at the discretion of the board. So we can choose a dollar amount. I say we, it's not necessarily us, but this board can choose a dollar amount in any given year, not to go under the original floor that was established with the creation of the foundation of the hospital. Does that make sense? The public gave permission to tax up to 2 mil for the nursing home. 2 mil this year would be 120 something, or I'm sorry, I'm misspeaking, for the LCC, it's called Services for the Elderly, Programs for the Elderly. I misspoke. Let me back up. The public gave permission for us to tax up to 2 mil for services for the elderly, which in previous years had all gone to the LCCA, which ended up in a big savings account, okay? The commission can then choose a dollar amount. It doesn't necessarily have to equal any particular mill.
amount.
Right, and so it's the permission to tax that. If you're talking about bringing to a public vote additional mills for the hospital, if you wanted to raise it, and actually, there might even be a statutory limit on the amount that any commission can actually potentially tax on the people. I'm not sure about that, but we would have to check. That might be true.
You're probably right about that, but I think there's also some leeway in how you write the question. So I think, the question apparently in the past was something akin to, allow the hospital to be subsidized up to 10 mils.
Well, I think that's what it is now,
Yes.
up to.
Up to X mils
Yeah,
or whatever.
that's why we had to,
But certainly, I think you could, if you were to do it over again, you could
We'd
write
have
it
to
differently
look at all of those. I know exactly what you're
and
saying.
say-
it could be,
and
you
say
have to give
at
10.
10 mils,
Yeah.
not up to 10.
Right.
I mean, so it's,
Yeah.
I don't know, yeah, legal end of that. Yeah, David?
I have 4 quick questions. First question I have is, in June, the Board of Trustees took action and voted to put the trustees' names with some public contact information on the hospital website. This was voted and moved and voted and approved in June. Does the board know when that will be done on the hospital website?
the board does not know exactly when that will happen.
That's a no. What's your next question?
Thank you. My second question is, in June, the board approved amending their bylaws, and you'll recall a copy of the amended bylaws, I guess you would refer to as a red line copy, where it's the original copy of your bylaws, but with like hundreds of crossed out lines and added words. The board took action and approved all those amendments. Has the entire board received a finished copy of the actual bylaws that processed those approved changes?
Your question is, has the board published it, not has anybody particularly
Well,
received it?
my question is whether
Have the individual board members received the
finished
fixed,
approved copy? since
what you
they-
approved and it got redone and,
I don't have a copy.
But that's not a question for you. Your question is, have they finished the bylaws?
Well, they approved the changes.
Okay, and have they published it?
I guess
That's the
not.
question. Has it been published?
Right here, he
I
said.
just happen to have a copy right here.
That was my second.
All right.
Thank you. My third question is, every month the Board of Trustees receive financial reports, which include a complete accounts payable register and standardized income and balance statements that show the monthly performance of the hospital and clinics, as well as year-to-date, a comparison with the prior year, and how you're doing on budget. Earlier this year in May and June, I believe there was an error and your salary and benefits were being overstated by about $350,000.
Has that been fixed?
That was fixed.
It's
yes.
fixed.
Right, but what
That
I
was
want to know
fixed.
is, did the Board of Trustees ever know, because they're being handed out these reports each month, did any of the Board of Trustees notice the mistake in May and June, and were they informed in July when the mistake was corrected?
that's an
No.
internal problem,
No,
and the
this
question
is,
has been
but this is
fixed.
exactly what we've asked them.
I know,
For
but
their
that's-
fiscal responsibility on the matter.
I understand that, but
So was
that's
that
not,
discussed in the meeting, I guess, is part of our question? Did you have discussions on that? Did anyone notice it in the meeting when you went over the financials? And if not, did you discuss it then in the next meeting's financials when the error was corrected?
I think we discussed that in August, did we not?
I've never had that
The error
discussion.
was repaired before we ever had a meeting.
But did we discuss?
No, you received, yes, okay, I see what you're saying. It was repaired before your next meeting, and but we're asking, did the board have any discussion on that? Or question it, or figure out what the error was? The board?
No board member brought it up.
No.
I guess my question is, were they aware of it? Okay, and then my final question relates to your cash position. As you know, every month you're handed a report from your CEO and CFO that shows the cash, what they call available cash for operations, and your current period planned expenses. I have records going back now about 3 years, and I've had conversations with a former trustee, and the records and that trustee seem to indicate that your cash position often was above $1 million each month, and generally hovered, around $1 million to maybe in the low. It was sometimes lower to around the $500,000 range. As you know, at the beginning of this calendar year and into the fiscal year, you had close to $1 million being reported for your available cash. And then in the spring and summer, it plunged. And I do acknowledge that in June, you told that the board was informed that there was roughly $500,000 in delayed payments, in part due to a billing software upgrade problem, and that the money was expected, and the report had said it was expected to come in within 10 days of the report. And this was in July that this was reported. So your available cash plunged to under $200,000, which was, it might not have been the all-time record, but it was, I went back a long time and never saw it go that low. Well, the following month, I believe the board was informed that a significant amount of the money that was expected came in. But your cash position barely budged up. And as late as your September 20th report, your reported cash was only $299,000. My question is that your budget, which the board approved, showed that you were projecting roughly $1 million loss, about $1.2 million in the clinics, but the hospital frequently makes money. So the hospital's projected surplus of a couple $100,000 offset, so you were only budgeting about $1 million loss. That included depreciation, which is non-cash, but it also included the subsidy and grants that you were expecting. And the point I'm making is that with that $1 million loss, when you take out the non-cash items like depreciation, it was expected, and I think this was acknowledged when you made the hiring and you were talking about a spin-up time to bring in new revenue in the clinics, that you would expect the cash balance to drop by $500,000 based on that budget, and it apparently has. So my question is now that your cash balance plunged down, and so far has only come up to about $299,000 as of your last report, given your forecast of $1 million loss through next March, do you currently have enough funding identified to execute the budget that you're currently planning through the end of your fiscal year, or will you need some new source of revenue between now and March to obviously maintain enough cash for operations?
Yes.
The answer is yes. Where is that in a different account?
This question was, do we anticipate being able to fund our budget? Yes, we do.
I guess that's coming back to my question. I don't know how. I mean, I don't feel like we've discussed that or talked about how that'll happen, or have we?
Well, I still think we have some payments outstanding, that's part of it.
You're still expecting back payments that you haven't received yet to the amount of,
I don't know,
I'm not sure.
but we're not done with
But I think what he's saying is basically you were carrying $1 million to fund the projected loss of $1 million, So if you're down to 300,000, where's the other 700,000 come from? A portion of that may be back payments, which is maybe, you don't know. So to get to and through March, then, how does that work? I'm not sure, because with the county, we're always budgeting what we have to spend, not what we're projected to lose, so.
Well, as I said, basically, we got our audit report in, August meeting, this every year, so we knew we had not made our, debt service. So as I discussed with PBC, within the last month or so, we're looking, for, a review of our charges, things of that nature. That won't do us a lot of good, but that's what's required. But at the same time, knowing what's going on, we've looked at a couple of other new programs to try and generate revenue, one of which should come online in October, which hopefully, it's not much, but it's better than nothing. It's going to be somewhere from $7,000 to $9,000 a month. We also will have a lot of expenses going, hopefully, we won't be expending any more money on 340B refunds. We're also dropping a physician off of our payroll beginning next month. So, yes, we will be.
But that was included in the budget, right?
No, it wasn't.
It
No,
wasn't?
It was not. We did not project that in the budget that we published in March because we did not know all of the facts that were going on. So, we expect some of the expenses. We did have some expenses go away. For instance, when, right after the Dr. Chima got here, we cut about probably $45,000 to $55,000 out of clinic expenses because the Dr. Chima and I now share fundamentally the clinic operations, and so we're doing that. So we pared away some. This has been discussed. This was brought up at our last meeting. Somebody suggested we hire a clinic manager, and it was pointed out by one of the other board members that we had just saved that $45,000 to $50,000 by not filling that particular position. So we're cutting expenses where we can, which is difficult. We are doing our best, yes, to get through the end of next March. I think we've got a couple of other sources of revenue coming in. Not huge chunks, but it'll be enough to get us through.
I had a question about how you were budgeting for the payroll for the doctors. Is all of that coming out of the clinic budgets, or is it split between?
Basically, the clinic budget is there just because we need to have a budget. But what we're working on now with our accountants, and this is one of the things that came out of our meetings with our accountants, is reallocating some of the position salaries to other hospital departments. So we're allowed under GASB, which are the government acceptable accounting, accepted government accounting practices. So we're working on that as well. We redistributing them. But yes, basically final, it's the aggregate budget that you want to look at. You don't want to just look at the Sylvan Grove Clinic. You don't want to just look at Lincoln Medical Clinic, and the hospital subsidizes basically hospital operations. Having those, I like to say, butts in beds is what pays the bills. And so that's where we generate the bulk of our income. But we have to allocate each of those different cost centers, the hospitals, the cost center, the clinics. So we develop budgets along those lines.
So in this current year's
That's why,
budget,
you can say to a certain extent that, just because you show red in one portion of the budget is
But in this current year's budget, did you take the physician's salary line item 100% out of the clinics? Or
Yes, it's.
100%
now it's coming-
from
yeah,
the
it's coming
clinics?
out of the clinics. It's all come out of the clinics. We're in the process. You can't just wave a magic wand and make these things happen. So we're in the process of working with our lawyers and accountants to shift some of the salary funds in the other parts of the hospital where Medicare will reimburse some of those costs. So we're working on that now.
Okay. Did you have anything?
I don't, yeah.
I would just like to say that we talked about how this is all new to us and it's all different. And I would just like to commend Randy. I think part of the reason it's different is because he has been more present in the meetings, asking questions, answering questions than all the years before. He has really called us to account, I feel like, and I think that's very important and overdue and great.
Well, thanks. I think this board has actually done a pretty good job, and they have a tough situation, you guys have it. I know we've had this meeting tonight, I don't think it's to criticize you so much, it's just that I think we're all for the hospital. Sometimes you may think we had a cut in some of your subsidy that we gave for next year, and some people think maybe we were against the hospital or something, and I don't think that is true. It's just we were concerned about the financial situation of the hospital, that's all. And we want to make it work. We want to help you work with you guys to make it work. I do anyway. And I think these two also do. That's what else, that's all I got.
That's a conflict of interest for me.
Yeah, he doesn't want to see it work.
Well, I
But-
think, yeah, when
You
you
go
ask
ahead.
questions, people immediately get on the defensive. Anytime you ask someone a question, whether it's a personal question, whether it's a financial question, even if it's public knowledge, you ask that question and it immediately goes to a defensive tactic by the person who's being asked the question. And that needs to stop because these boards are actually very integrally connected and the question should be constant so that there is updated information. Imagine the difference in the communication when those budget times overlap between March and August if there had been a plea for full funding because this was a particular year. And that wasn't what was portrayed to us. It was, well, it'll just exponentially grow. So that needs, if that's the idea, then that needs to come from the board to the commission needs to agree to that. And the hospital's actually.
That's part of our budget planning process this year.
Yeah. And what
Budget for.
What hit us too is I know you guys had your budget, you were thinking to 10 mills. Well, we had in August, we were doing our budget and our auditor said our tax lid was gonna be lower. Now we so we had to find places to cut the total budget and all of our appropriations. Or go to the vote in the fall and ask the citizens if they would want to raise the mill levy enough to fund more. We decided to make some cuts, and you guys were part of that. And let me remind you now that it sounds like it's a big cut. You guys had this year, on your report here, I was there, from Mr. Otting, that you guys had 7.2 million in revenue this year, and some of that is from the 570,000 from the commissioners or from the county, but you had 8.5 million in expense. So what we gave was 570,000 this year, next year will be 500,000. So we're basically cutting you 70,000 from this year's budget. And that really, 7.2 million in revenue. So that 70,000 is 1% less of your revenue next year than what we gave you this year. And I know you was expecting to go up with the mill levy to 620,000 or 610,000. So 1% is what we cut you revenue from this year to go into next year. So a lot of the community also thinks we're made a big slashing cuts to the hospital. We didn't. We did 1% from this year's budget to next year. So that needs to let the public know all that too, okay? And that's
Also let the public know we were not informed of the changes in
Yeah.
the budget
Okay,
process.
I'm gonna
that we were
stop
doing
that
this year.
conversation right there.
Well, we
Because
didn't-
it
but-
is, excuse me
Yeah,
1 second.
okay.
It is the obligation of the hospital board to present the budget to the commission, not to the PBC. The PBC is just a generated name for a commission board that was put together by the commission so that the obligations of the bonds could fall ultimately on the county. So if there is a forfeiture of the hospital to the obligations of the bond, then the county becomes ultimately responsible for that $5 million. That's what the PBC is for. You
Right.
keep saying that you kept reporting to the PBC. That is not what this issue is. The hospital board, and I'll address the board because it's not necessarily your responsibility either, sir. The hospital board is to report the budget to the commission, and there is to be a back and forth communication. You can read the statute about it. I was ignorant to it. A citizen brought it to my attention. There is to be a back and forth communication for 30 days on the budget so that we can have the exact conversation we're having now before the commission finalizes their own budget. And that has been the failure of the board.
No,
And the
no,
yes.
no.
Yes, it
You
has.
had a representative from your board attend all of our board meetings. We discussed all of this
No.
in front of your representatives. If it didn't get communicated to you, that's not the fault of my board.
No, absolutely it is, because if you read
No,
the
it is not.
statute,
It
yes,
is not.
if you read the statute, it says that the board is to present their budget as they have it ready to approve to the commission. And you can fault one individual commissioner who could have brought the information back and forth. That's not where I'm going with that. I'm going straight to the board and saying, the precedent has been set. This isn't reinventing the wheel. I didn't make this up. It's something I've been ignorant to, but now that I know, that is the process. And we informally tried to abide by that this year. It wasn't done very well, but of course, you had already finalized your budget and we had not even begun to work on ours at that point. So hopefully that would kick the commission into gear a little earlier in the year to start thinking about their own budget as well,
So
which
is
we
all
failed
this
to do.
give and take supposed to take place in May, June?
June.
May, June?
Yes, I would have to pull that up. It's June.
I think by the end of June is what I remember.
Well, there's a 30-day period of communication where it's 10 days forward, 10 days back, and 10 days again, and then the finalization.
So I'll take the blame for the one who brought KSA 194607C to the attention of the Board of County Commissioners and the public on Facebook, which I know many of you have been following. I had a question for the board and the CEO. Do you recall that in March, I sent you written correspondence when I was trying to follow up on my core request to receive a copy of the budget, that I introduced that letter that said that the importance for me to get access to the budget was that statute. And does anyone recall that I wrote the CEO and the trustees about KSA 194607C in March? Does anyone remember that you asked your attorney for legal advice on that, and then that legal advice was distributed to the trustees soon after? Did any of you see this coming as far as a possibility?
Well, there are a couple of issues there, David. Yes, we conferred not only with our attorney, but also with our peer hospitals. And yes, not everybody submits a budget to their county commission. And when they do submit a budget to their county commission, it's a courtesy only. And so I believe that's what I discussed with my board in regard to your March letter. So the other thing that we disagreed with you on is the fact that under Florida, we're allowed to charge you for the cost of generating the reports that we give to you.
Okay, I'm just going to read from
Yes,
the
sir.
actual book because your
Well-
verbal banter there is not correct. I'm just going to read the whole section C. It specifically says you shall submit.
Yeah.
So the board shall hold meetings at least once each month and shall keep and maintain a complete record of all its proceedings. Such records shall be available for inspection by the commission on request. A simple majority of the members serving on the board shall constitute a quorum for the transaction of business. Within 15 days after completion of the audit provided by Article 11 of Chapter 75 of Kansas Statutes annotated, and acts amendatory to the provisions thereof or supplemental thereto, the board shall file with the commission a written report of the management of the hospital and a copy of the audit report rendered by the accountant performing the audit. The commission shall keep and maintain a copy of such report as part of the public records of the county. Prior to June 1 of each year, the board shall prepare, the board means the hospital board, not the commission board, Prior to June 1 of each year, the board shall prepare a budget showing the amount it deems necessary to operate, equip, maintain, and improve the hospital for the ensuing fiscal year and the amount of that portion thereof that it deems necessary to be raised by the tax authorized under KSA 194606, and shall submit its proposed budget to the commission, or in case of an elected board, which you're not, to the county clerk. If the commission does not approve the proposed budget within 10 days after the receipt thereof, it shall return the budget to the board. Upon receipt of the returned budget, the board shall consider amendments or modifications and may consult with the commission concerning the budget. Hence, the conversation that we may be having now, which could have happened in June. Within 10 days after the receipt of the returned budget, the board shall resubmit its proposed budget with or without amendment or modification to the commission, which means you do not have to take our suggestions for the modification on your budget. However, that would potentially deem it possible that the commission would withhold its funding to you. Within 10 days after resubmission of the proposed budget, the commission shall approve, amend, or modify and approve as amended or modified such proposed budget. The commission shall adopt the proposed budget as approved and shall make the same part of the regular county budget. In the case of an elected board, the commission, or the submission of the budget to the commission shall not be required. So you're basically saying that it's not required, but you're not this is an elected board, so they are required. They're appointed.
I understand
Okay.
that. It's that
It's not, but you
particular
called it a
sense.
courtesy.
E-
It's
even-
not a courtesy.
We even interviewed people with the Kansas Association of Counties, and they said that it was very poor compliance with that particular statute.
That
It's not
what?
enforced.
There's poor compliance with that statute.
Poor compliance doesn't mean, that doesn't mean
But
that
I
it's.
understand, but, you know, you're throwing a bunch of new requirements at us that have not been part of the operation of this county commission and vis-a-vis this board at any time in the past. So we're going basically by precedent, and precedent at times is important, and it can make a difference in the operation.
I already
Again.
told you, I claim ignorance to it. I was ignorant to that as well.
Right, so.
I'm just as much to blame for not having known what the function of the board and what the communication should have been.
Well, I think
But you
David's-
did get notification in March.
David's point was
So,
that he
yeah.
presented that.
You already had
in March.
notification, yeah. So, that's not to say that we don't want to see the success of the hospital. I just think that the assumption and what you projected in your last meeting about the commission making cuts purposefully as some sort of multi-pronged attack on the elderly in the community, that's not acceptable in my mind, and this board is appointed by us, and they're to do our bidding. And us consolidating our expenses, reducing our expenses, staying under the tax lid, and making sure that we're providing for our statutory duties, that takes priority for the board. And so from 570,000, as was just pointed out, to 500,000 as 1% of your overall total operating expenses and budget, that cannot be portrayed as the commission creating this deficit that's gonna put the hospital under. Because that's not what's gonna happen.
Hospital's budget's irrelevant. The only thing we're talking about is the tax money that we're getting. That's the only thing that's an issue. Our budget could be $10 million. The only thing we're discussing is the tax money that we get. And a drop from 500,000 to 570, from
570 to 5.
That's almost a 9% drop.
No, it's 1% of your operating budget though. That was the point.
I'm just saying, the hospital's overall budget doesn't matter. The only thing we're talking about is the tax levy money. That's the only thing this discussion is about. And you're going from 575,000 to 500,000. You're dropping it 9%.
I think the argument would be that the budget does matter because we didn't present that budget as we should have in May to be discussed by June 1st so that those provisions could be made and we could see how much was needed, why, where. That's what's being discussed right now. Obviously, the budget matters or we wouldn't need this. We wouldn't need a CEO, you wouldn't need a board, you wouldn't need anybody.
What I'm saying is the only thing we're discussing is the tax mill levy.
I think we're discussing much more than that.
Well, if you wanna put that in perspective for our budget, that line item that we're expending, the 570,000, dropping that 570,000 down to 500,000, you're calling that a 9% drop for our expenditure on that line item within our budget, that particular line item. We cut a lot of other things. We cut almost everything else except our own internal departments because we had everyone turn in a budget that was just about the same expenses for commodities and contracts, save those few things that went up. And the only increase there was the budgeted increase for salary line item for a raise. So in order for us to stay within the tax lid, which it works just a slightly different than was explained earlier, the tax lid is what, a 1.5% of our overall budget, and we can go outside of that in emergency services. So there was a greater than 1.5 increase for our sheriff's department, which ultimately, if the sheriff's department decides to overexpend its budget, the commission has to finance that regardless. That's one thing. The EMS can potentially go outside of that tax lid and have a greater increase than 1.5%. Other than that, I think the county attorney is the only other particular line item in our budget that can go above a 1.5% increase. So for us to budget a 1.5% increase to even give a raise, I mean, I think the hospital gives more than a 1.5% increase in raise, right?
We have to stay competitive in our market.
So do we. So in order to do the 1.5% and stay within that tax lid, if we were increasing anybody's wages for next year, we had to cut other line items in our budget, which we did to almost everything.
Did you cut everybody 9%?
That's not how that works, though. That's what I'm trying to explain to you.
I'm just saying
The
you cut the
expenses to
hospital
have 5
9%.
employees in one department and the expenses to have 27 employees in another department are completely different. So to fund a raise for 27 employees and stay under a 1.5% increase, you can't do. So you have to take whatever that percentage increase is and take it from other expenditures in your budget. So no, it was not a 9% decrease across the board. No, it wasn't. In fact, other people got caught a lot more. We cut 50% to Central Kansas Mental Health because they have never given a specific number as far as they've given a number of visits, but never a specific number of patients in our county.
In our
So it's kind of hard to judge there.
In our senior services, we went from 75,000 to 50, and that's for like senior center and council on the aging, so that's a bigger percentage. And they have a lot less
I think we
budget.
did 60.
What, we
I
went
think it
from-
was 60.
We went from 75 to 50.
50? I thought it was
Yes,
60.
we did.
Yes. So there was a bigger percent, and they need the money, because I think they do a very good job of senior center and all of that, but,
Yeah, some of them got cut a lot more than 9%, up to 50%. Which will be hard to ever increase, because when we have, if we have a continuing tax lid, or if we don't increase taxes, then you can't necessarily build that back into the budget. It's already been cut. But that saves our internal mechanisms. We're statutorily required to fund a health department, to fund our sheriff's office, to have an EMS service. We're funding a county unit highway system. So all of those things have taken up the majority of our budget. And actually, the hospital was single-handedly the second largest line item expense for a long time. In fact, I think EMS is next, and it's still under the 500,000.
yeah, the hospital
The highway department, and then I think the
departments.
sheriff's department is still under 500,000.
But I'm just saying, those are the higher
Yeah.
expenditures we
Yeah.
have, then the 500,000
Yeah,
appropriations to the
yeah.
hospital.
At this point, the hospital is still the second largest expense for the county, even with the $70,000 cut. You're still the second largest expense.
If you wanna look at it differently too, the hospital has a bigger budget than all of the county commission budget put together. We have like this year it's like 7 million, I think, or up to 8.2, but you guys had that too, so. And I'm not against the hospital again, it's not an attack on the hospital, but that's where you're at. So you guys have a big budget. You have more authority over more money spending than we do, really. Or close to the same, actually. So that's not bad or good, I'm just saying that, so the public knows that.
Which that number in itself speaks to the importance of the health of the hospital to this community.
Yeah, and I'm for I'm not against the hospital, I'm for the hospital, but we should all know where all the money's being spent and how much it costs, that's all I'm saying.
I think we're ultimately here because you're disappointed to see the 570,000 drop to 500,000. I do understand that. if there needs to be a discussion next year about the requirement for the budget to be subsidized by the commission, it needs to happen earlier in the year. And we also have to face our own employees in our own departments and talk to them about if there are going to be cuts, or if we're to stay within the tax lid, how that happens. And if this particular line item gets increased, where does that money come from? So I think we need to see a budget in preparation. You said you're already working on next year's. And
Preliminarily.
you had suggested a 6-month, did you mean in your current operating year? Is that,
Well, yes, because we've had a lot of changes, I think we need, if that would help you out.
yeah,
And give us the money you cut from us, well, I think that would, if I could show that, would you do that?
well, we can't. The budget is set. After we set the budget, even at the
Okay, you're
hearing,
talking about taking it out of county general, why don't you take it out of the wind tower fund?
the web fund,
No, the wind tower fund, not the web benefit fund, the wind tower fund.
Maybe we'll next year. We'll have to see.
Probably not. That cannot be used for operating expenses, as I recall the rules.
well, that whole situation is debatable. At this point, I think we have in there,
4 million.
yeah, close to 5 million.
Well, that would be a discussion issue.
That's what I've always heard. I've never looked it up, but I've heard that the principal can be used, but for the interest can be used, but.
We have only spent it on capital expenditures.
Like
Historically, if you want to talk about precedent, it's only been spent on, I think there have been 3 expenses. One was machinery, they bought some machinery with it originally, 2014, I want to say. And then there was the renovation to the nursing home as a capital expense. And then the capital
Schools.
expenses for the schools to
Last year.
purchase HVAC and roofing, that kind of thing. So historically speaking, it's not ever been used for operating expenses.
We would certainly have a capital expenditure on that in the budget, which could be used.
I understand.
I don't have any more
Does
to
anyone else have any comments or questions before I adjourn the meeting?
I'd like to say something. I'm a standing proof of Dr. Dragoni. 24 years ago today, I was in a hospital in Salina. On the 9th of September, I was in a tractor accident. An ambulance came and got me and took me to the Lincoln Hospital. Dr. Dragoni hadn't been there very long, but he knew he was like a first-class first aid station. He knew who to call and how to get me down the road. And possibly without his service then, I wouldn't be here tonight even saying this. So he's always been my doctor, but I didn't go to him any more than what I had to. But let me tell you, there's one thing about that accident was I had a finger that was smashed in a hitch hooking up an anhydrous tank. It smashed my finger. And I went in to see him, and he gave me a big shot of antibiotic right in the hip. And that is really what kept me from getting an infection in my head, where I had a severe head injury. So both the hospital and ambulance in Lincoln County and Salina helped me survive and alive today. So I think if it just comes down to a first-class first aid station, that's good. That's what it used me for.
Thank you. All right, this commission shall stand adjourned until Monday at 10 a.m. in the courthouse.
Willem, can I keep this?
Huh?
Can I keep this, the bylaws?
Well, of course.